Warm welcome to the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute's seminar series on Towards 2030, where we look at the challenges and opportunities for implementing the Paris Agreement in this crucial decade ahead of us, and in particular because we're running into the next Conference of Parties in just over a year's time in Glasgow that will review and confirm all countries' commitments to implementation of the Paris Agreement between 2020 and 2030, and look at the long-term goal of 2050 as well. Today we're really privileged. We're going to have a look at the US election and what that might mean for the road to 2030 and beyond. Before I introduce our esteemed speakers, let me acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, thank you. I want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people. I'm on their land here in Melbourne, as well as the traditional owners and First Nations people of all lands that all of us, no matter where we are, will be situated on. I want to acknowledge that Indigenous Australians have been custodians of the lands and waters for thousands of generations. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Today, we're really privileged to have two guests online, I think in the evening, from the US. And so firstly, I'd like to introduce them both. A little bit on the format. We're going to have remarks from our speakers, then some Q&A and discussion between us, and then we'll open it to questions from the audience, and we'll try and bring ourselves in on time for our discussion. I'd like to introduce Catherine Flowers. Catherine, great to have you on the line. Thank you so much. Catherine is founder of the Centre for Rural Enterprise and Environmental Justice. The Centre seeks to implement best practices to address reduction of health and economic disparities within the context of climate change and environmental justice. Catherine, you're currently a board member of the Natural Resources Defence Council and a member of the board of the Climate Reality Project. Catherine's an internationally recognised advocate for human rights to water and sanitation, and you work on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Catherine, I also wanted to mention that you're on the Biden-Sanders Climate Change Unity Task Force that's chaired by Senator Kerry and AOC. And you've got a book coming out November 17 on waste, W-A-S-T-E. But if you don't mind, we're very privileged to have you because last week you were awarded one of the so-called MacArthur Genius Foundation, or MacArthur Foundation Genius Awards, I should say. So big warm welcome, Catherine. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, thank you.
And may I also welcome Roy Neal. Roy, thanks so much for joining us. Roy's coming in from Washington, DC, I think. Hey, Catherine, I forgot to ask, where are you coming in from?
Montgomery, Alabama.
Alabama.
The cradle of the civil rights movement.
Thank you so much. And Roy, you're in Washington, DC at the moment, aren't you?
Yes.
Yeah, great, Roy. Thanks. Roy, let me return to my proper job here. Roy was President Clinton's Deputy Chief of Staff and for many years was Chief of Staff for Senator and then Vice President Al Gore. Roy, you joined with Al to help him develop up the documentary An Inconvenient Truth, if I'm saying that correctly, and then also assisted and helped Al lead with the founding of the Climate Reality Project itself. Roy is an adjunct professor of political science at Vanderbilt University, where you teach courses in the US presidency and presidential transitions. And Roy, you're also the author of a political thriller, The Electors, who we assume are hard at work at the moment in the US. Roy, great to have you on board. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Don.
maybe to get going, Catherine, do you mind if I ask you first if you'd like to make some opening remarks? They'd be really warmly welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me be a part of this. And I am basically going to talk about how climate change is playing out in this area. I live in a global southern part of the United States, which is along the Gulf Coast. And the Gulf Coast, if it had a vote, is certainly telling us about climate change, because recently we've had historic hurricanes. We've had so many hurricanes. Actually, before I got on this Zoom call, I got a notice on my phone that there's another tropical cyclone that's developing in the Caribbean. We've had so many hurricanes lately that it has already gone through the alphabet and now is on the Greek alphabet. And a lot of these areas that are being impacted over and over and over again, primarily the area in Louisiana, between Louisiana and the Gulf Coast of Florida. But lately, Louisiana has been struck twice by hurricanes, and these hurricanes are increasing in intensity, and it's happening very, very fast. I am of an age that I remember when I was growing up. If anyone want to go and look it up, the hurricane that came to mind for me when I was a kid was Hurricane Camille that cleaned out the Gulf Coast. But it is nothing like it was then. I mean, I've lived long enough to see climate change and the impacts that it's having. And it's having impacts on the same communities, the frontline communities, over and over and over again. And what's significant about that is also along the Gulf Coast, you will find, besides these environmental justice issues, you're gonna find a lot of communities that are impacted by the fossil fuel industry and petrochemical plants. Along that same area is called Cancer Alley because of all the pollution that's coming up from these multinational petrochemical plants that are impacting the health and well-being of people that are living in those areas. But what's even greater than that is seeing what it's doing with the climate altogether. So people are getting a double and a triple whammy that are living in these frontline communities because of what is happening with climate change. Climate change in the US is not just I don't want to talk about all of it because I'm sure that Roy can talk about some of it from firsthand experience too. But if you look at what's happening on the West Coast with the wildfires, you know, you look at what's happening in other areas where people are talking about having heat and I mean, the type of temperatures that they've never had before. So it's going to be, this election is going to be very, very important, not only for the Paris Accords, but also for people that are suffering right now in environmental justice communities as it relates to climate change. And I think that I think we had one omission recently where some of the people that are running for office are saying, well, we know that the climate is changing, but we don't know what's caused it. We don't know whether it's man-made. All they have to do is go to the Gulf Coast and see what's happening in areas like in Cancer Alley, and they can see firsthand what's going on if they would do that.
Catherine, thanks so much. Let me invite some remarks from Roy, and then we'll come to some discussion if that's okay. Roy, could I warmly welcome some comments from you?
Thanks, Don, and it's a real pleasure to be on this program. What you didn't mention is that in the past, I've served as a visiting lecturer at the University of Melbourne and had a wonderful opportunity there to see the interest of Australians in this issue, in large part from your leadership. And Catherine, I'm a fellow Southerner, and I've seen in my home state of Tennessee horribly destructive tornadoes like we have never seen before, and hurricanes making it all the way into the state. So it's become certainly a universal problem, but we're seeing extraordinary impacts of this throughout the country in places we've never seen before. Of course, in the Gulf, near where you are, you have experience with hurricanes, but they're now so much more severe. My interest in this issue, beyond the policy determinations, is in the raw politics of it right now. It's always said as you're coming up to a presidential election that this is the most important election of your lifetime. This is what candidates say and advocates say. But I can say that this is certainly at least the second most important election of my lifetime, with the election of 2000 being a close second. And we don't need to go there, but there's an instructive example of what we've seen over the last, 40 years now. There's a pattern where we've seen Democratic presidents institute interesting and far-reaching conservation measures, energy conservation. Jimmy Carter was a leader in deploying and attempting to deploy renewable energy initiatives. Someone put solar collectors on the White House. Ronald Reagan, who defeated Jimmy Carter in 1980, came in. They immediately ripped those solar panels off the White House as a symbolic, in-your-face gesture. We saw the same thing after Bill Clinton and Al Gore left office in 2000. George W. Bush came into power and installed any number of people who were more clever than the current Trump crowd. They gave lip service to caring about climate, but they put the wrong people in these positions. They put people in top positions who were not the least bit interested in acting on climate. And we had a real setback, both through executive orders and through administrative fiat, a setback in all of the Clinton-Gore initiatives during that period. And now we have Donald Trump. And it would take the rest of this program to inventory the incredible setbacks we've seen under Trump. At the beginning, as we know, he announced that he would withdraw from the Paris Accord. He called climate change a hoax. He installed coal and oil and fossil fuel lobbyists in top positions in the White House, even at the Environmental Protection Administration, which is almost a sacrilege. He has said essentially that acting on climate would destroy the U.S. economy. He's used inflammatory language throughout this, exerted no leadership on these issues, not only on climate, but on the general environment issues. He's reduced emission standards and fuel standards. Just last week, his administration lowered the methane restrictions. He's fast-tracked environmental reviews for offshore oil drilling and so on. The list just goes on and on. So we have perhaps the most dramatic contrast right now. And I'm not trying to give a campaign speech, but just to sort of amplify what pretty much everybody knows, that there couldn't be more difference between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Now, before we move on, just to say one thing. Joe Biden, if elected, and it appears that he will be, can essentially restore the U.S. presence in the climate accord with a stroke of a pen, and can do it very quickly. There'll be a period between the election, if Trump does execute on November 4th, a withdrawal, there'll be a period of 10 weeks that'll be in limbo. But Joe Biden will re-enter the U.S. in the climate accord, in the Paris Accord. The greater challenge, though, frankly, is convincing Congress and the American people to take these very serious and very dramatic steps to meet the goals that are embedded in the Paris Accord. So we'll talk a little bit about that later, but the political challenge for President Biden is going to be great.
Roy, thanks so much. Let's have a little bit of discussion. Catherine, could I go back to you? Could you maybe talk a little bit about the policy development process with Biden? And you've sat on the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force. Obviously, we're not asking you to reveal anything that's private, but could you just talk a little bit about process and policy settings, both for the US and internationally, on climate, and what you've observed through that task force?
Well, basically, the task force came about, as you know, Senator Bernie Sanders was also a candidate for the president. And when he decided that it wasn't possible for him to get the nomination, he threw his support behind Biden. And as a result, they put together these numerous task forces, and one was the climate change task force. And I was invited by Senator Sanders' staff to serve on the task force, along with, there were 3 people that were chosen by Senator Sanders for this particular task force. One was AOC, and the other one was Varshini Prakash, who was one of the founders of the Sunrise Movement. And we also joined the Biden appointees, which included Secretary John Kerry, who co-chaired the committee, this task force, along with AOC, Representative Kathy Castor, who really shortly after we convened our task force, released a report from Congress. It was, I think she chairs a task force that dealt with climate change. Carrie Dugan, who had formerly worked with the vice president dealing with communications, Representative Connor Lamb, who is from Pennsylvania, the illustrious Gina McCarthy, who had been the EPA administrator, is now the CEO of NRDC, Representative Don McEachin, who is one of the persons who actually is one of the co-chairs of the Environmental Justice Committee in Congress, subcommittee in Congress. So basically our process was, because of COVID, we were unable to be together in person. So we met at least once a week where we talked about the policies, and we looked at various categories, but we decided that we agreed to a number of principles. And I think that to his credit, I have to credit the fact that Secretary Kerry was a diplomat and used his diplomatic skills for us to come up with an agreement. But there wasn't a lot of differences in terms of the policy. The differences was, how do we get there? And of course, AOC was one of the authors of the Green New Deal, and we were really pushing the Green New Deal and making sure that we switched to renewable energy, and that we had a grid. One of the things that she was pushing was a grid from coast to coast that was green, using renewables. We also talked about transportation and how we could make sure, because one of the things I learned in my travels, that I can go to Europe and get on the train and go all over, the continent pretty much. You can't do that here in the US. But we talked about that. We talked about how do we deal with building back better. In other words, we know that these storms are getting more intense, and a lot of these areas are being destroyed over and over and over again. For those people that will be able to return, how do we build these homes in a way? How do we retrofit them? How do we produce jobs that are good paying jobs, especially if we talk about transitioning away from fossil fuels. So those are the kinds of discussions that took place. And eventually we came up with a set of recommendations, a lot of which were adopted and accepted, because one of the things that I did this time when I tuned in and I listened to the Democratic Convention, I heard over and over again, environmental justice. And for the length of time that I've been doing this work in this area, I haven't heard it as much. And I'm glad to see it's embedded, because we can't talk about climate justice without talking about environmental justice, and especially environmental justice in frontline communities that are suffering right now. And I suspect that this is not just a US problem, that we see this problem around the world. But the policies that we came up with, it was a document that was at least 14 pages, with recommendations, a lot of which were accepted, and hopefully, once we get past November 3rd, it's part of the transition that we can see some of these being put into practice.
Catherine, thanks so much. Let me come back in a sec on that. Roy, just a question for people sitting in Australia or in this region. I mean, it's been a little bit noticeable that, for instance, in the presidential and the vice presidential debate, I think we've had questions about climate change for the first time at a substantial level in a US presidential election. I'd just appreciate your insights on where climate change is sitting in that political discourse this year, both in primaries and now in the presidential campaign.
Well, it's clear that climate change is high on the list of concerns of most voters. And I think this year in this presidential campaign, maybe for the first time, we will see a lot of climate voters. In other words, people that will make this a determinant in how they cast their vote, in large part because of the dramatic contrast between Trump and Biden. As Catherine is saying, the Biden-Harris team has an ambitious and progressive approach to climate, and the Trump campaign has essentially would like it to just go away. They use it as the idea of action on climate as a kind of epithet, saying, well, if you act on climate, you're going to destroy our economy. That hasn't helped Trump because, as you know, that in polling over the last 15 years, in fact, probably beginning with Al Gore's film, Inconvenient Truth, we've seen that issue rise in the public consciousness every year to the point now where it's quite established. So because of that, I think if we haven't turned a lot of Republicans, office holders, toward action on this issue, we certainly galvanized Democrats. Now, it'll be a challenge, of course, going forward, but public interest and is critical in this because these are the very people like Catherine and so many others who are going to lean on and hold public officials' feet to the fire going forward. So campaign promises are one thing, but the Biden promise, if you will, the Biden-Harris promise, seems something that they can actually move toward implementing.
Roy, thanks. Catherine, can I come back to you? Could you just talk a little bit about, you've mentioned how environmental justice and climate justice have become more prominent. Could, for an Australian audience, could you just help us understand that journey and how it's now having impact in a presidential campaign?
Well, I can share my own personal experience. I was, my work has been around water and wastewater in particular. And one of the things that I noticed was that in the area where I was doing the work, where people had raw sewage on the ground, I noticed that things were changing. I could see animals there that I would generally see where there were arid climates, because I used to teach geography. So in teaching geography, you had to, to help students understand that there were certain kinds of vegetation, animals, et cetera, certain minerals in certain parts of the world, certain parts of the country. And I would start seeing, those animals in the South, especially in Alabama, that I had never seen before. When I moved back to Alabama, after living in another part of the US, I initially had a palm tree that every time, it would get cold enough, I had to cover it every winter. I don't have to do that anymore. And I started to notice, it was in October several years ago, where I was called to a home where they had raw sewage on the ground. And where the raw sewage was, it was in October. And there was a time when, we wouldn't have mosquitoes in October because, we were in the fall of the year, but it was just like in the summer of the year. And on top of this raw sewage on the ground in this pit were all these mosquitoes, and I was bitten. I broke out in a rash. And after I broke out in the rash, I went to my doctor and they didn't see anything wrong. And I had this rash for quite a long time. But I saw an op-ed that was written in the New York Times by a gentleman named Dr. Peter Hotez. And Dr. Hotez talked about tropical diseases being in our area. And I reached out to him and I told him about what I had seen in terms of climate change. And this was like the intersection of climate change and environmental justice. And I was wondering whether or not American doctors were prepared for this, where they were testing for what could potentially be seen as something you see in either a developing country or even more so, someplace where it was a whole lot warmer, a different type of climate than the climate that we had there. And we actually did a study that we published in 2017 that made international news when we found evidence of hookworm and other tropical parasites in Lowndes County, Alabama. And some of these parasites, I know one person approached me and said that when he was traveling on the African continent, that he had actually gotten strongyloides, and he was just so surprised to find out that it was prevalent here. So one of the things that we're seeing, and we'll be seeing more of, are more and more evidence of certain kinds of illnesses or parasites that may not have been able to live in these areas can live now, and the warmer it gets, the more we're going to see. But the people that are impacted initially are these people that are living in poor communities and people that are living kind of on the margins of society, and in my particular area, in rural communities. So that's how we're seeing it played out, and that's why it's an environmental justice issue. And COVID, I think, is another example of that, because the areas that are impacted the most by COVID in the US, a lot of these rural communities that are being impacted, including Lowndes County, where I do a lot of my work. Lowndes County had the highest per capita death rate and infection rate in the state of Alabama. And one of the reasons could be is that this is where climate change and environmental justice issues come together and create these health disparities as well that make people more vulnerable to it. And if the policy of the administration is the same with climate change as we've seen with COVID, we're just going to have more death and destruction.
And Catherine, how have you got that discussion into the senior levels of the Biden-Harris candidacy?
That's a good question. I think that one of the things that was very helpful was the international attention. When we did that study, instead of allowing an American paper to break the news, we let The Guardian break the news. And we knew if The Guardian broke the news, that would be an international discussion about it. Also, with us being one of the wealthiest countries in the world, some of these diseases are neglected diseases of poverty, where you find in poor countries around the world. And even when we invited, I've been using the human rights framework and invite the UN's special rapporteur on extreme poverty to come to Lowndes County. And when he was there, one of the reporters asked him, had he ever seen anything like this before? And he said, yes, but this is very uncommon in the developed world. So the contrast there, I think, made people start taking a second look. But there has been a concerted effort by this current administration to look the other way when it comes to problems like this instead of trying to solve them. And I think the climate change is just one example of that.
Thank you so much. Roy, can I come back onto some structural issues? Someone growing up in Australia is not going to be used to the US transition process. So that period after the election through to when a new or the existing president is inaugurated or re-inaugurated for another term. Could you just help us understand that process and what's important to the climate issue and action on climate during that transition process, or as an outcome of that transition process?
Well, it's a good question, because the US, perhaps more than most countries or any other country, has a large gap of time between the election and when the new president takes office. In this case, 10 weeks between November 3rd, the election November 3rd, and we're not sure when we will know exactly who has won this race, but it'll probably be within a week or so, and in January 20th, when the new president is inaugurated. During that time, the president-elect and the vice president-elect have a lot to do. I mean, they have to essentially identify a White House staff, cabinet members, sub-cabinet members. They have to develop a program, a legislative program for the first month. They have a lot of diplomatic chores they have to do with foreign leaders. And all of this at the same time that the president is still Donald Trump and the vice president is Mike Pence. And they are president and vice president until January 20th. There are no structural rules to coordinate between the outgoing president and the incoming president. Now, tradition has dictated that there is cooperation, and the outgoing president, even if he is defeated, as was George H.W. Bush, Jimmy Carter, and so on, Even in those cases, there was civility and a cooperation in passing on the hands of the reins of power. We're not going to see that this time. We even have some speculation that the president may not want to leave office, even if he loses. But the things that will have to happen that will affect climate are, in this case, many. I mean, the first thing will be the development of a proposal that will be introduced perhaps even on day one to enact some version of the Biden-Harris in climate plan. And it'll probably involve something like $2 trillion to undertake a lot of dramatic activity. They have to put that together, and in doing so, they'll need to consult with Democratic leaders in the House and the Senate. Now, that's one thing. That's a policy proposal. But also critical to this will be the identification of the key players in that administration who will oversee environmental policy. The Environmental Protection Administration, the Department of Energy, the Department of Interior, and so on. Those are the officials that will step in and try quickly to reverse as many of the disastrous actions of the Trump administration as possible. During the transition, they will also have to identify all of the executive orders that President Trump has enacted, many of which were to overturn progressive climate and environmental rules that the Obama-Biden administration, and before that, the Clinton-Gore administration, had put in place. Now, those can be done very quickly without congressional approval, and they will have to inventory those things, and probably within the first week of taking office on January 20th, they will enact those executive orders, and those are absolutely critical for two reasons. One, to get those administrative agencies working on doing just that, going back and peeling back all the damage and trying to develop mechanisms for putting them back on track. Also, to send a public message that this administration is serious about doing this thing. It wasn't just a campaign promise. It wasn't just to try to get the left wing of the party in line for the election. This is a serious effort to attack this problem. And of course, as I said, they'll be preparing to rejoin the climate accord on day one. But they have to do all those things along with doing everything else. Simply picking a cabinet and getting them ready for confirmation by the new Senate is a real challenge. I can tell you, I've been involved in that twice, and it's a cumbersome, and it's challenging, and it's stressful, and it involves personalities. But one thing that will be for sure, there'll be a lot of goodwill, certainly on the Democratic side, and a lot of public goodwill to see that Biden and Harris can get through this process as quickly as possible and as successfully as possible.
Roy, thank you very much. I'm going to pull out some questions for us now coming up from the audience. Catherine, there's a question here. Is there any hope for a Biden presidency implementing a climate justice program as ambitious as the Sanders Green New Deal proposal?
That's a good question. I think that it is the first step is getting someone elected who will hear us. Then the next step is holding their feet to the fire. So I think as long as we hold their feet to the fire, we may not get exactly what we want, but we'll get close to it. And I think that I'm of the belief that we don't just elect a person to office and leave them there, but we have to still apply the pressure. And I think that, what I know of AOC and the Sunrise Movement and other young people and people I've been working with across the country that are pushing for this Green New Deal, I think we're going to see some variation of it if we don't see it put, in place all at one time. But I think that we're going to see more of it than we would have seen had we not had a Biden presidency.
Catherine, how do you, once again, watching from afar here, if one's watching the presidential debate or the vice presidential debates, there's a fault line there over the Green New Deal. Could you just talk a little bit about how you're seeing that play out publicly?
Well, I think that, well, we got to keep in mind that there are people in some of these battleground states, places like Pennsylvania, where they are still fracking. And there are people that support the Green New Deal that don't support fracking. But we also have to have a just transition. In other words, we know that the climate change is a problem. We got to address it, and we need to do it as soon as possible. But we also have to figure out, and this is going to be the challenge of the new administration, to figure out how do we transition people to good paying jobs where they can support their families. And then on top of that, this is happening after COVID, where there are economic problems that are manifesting as a result of people not being able to work. A lot of businesses are failing as a result. And I think that it's going to be a challenge. But I also feel that there's enough support that is starting to generate from the ground up that's going to put the administration in a position where it is going to have to have some iteration of a Green New Deal, whether they call it that or not. There has to be some iteration of it. And I think that they've been conservative. I know there was a question asked about that, about the Green New Deal, and that was kind of skirted around, but it's something that we have to have. We got to deal with climate change. And whether they call it the Green New Deal or the Blue New Deal, we have to have some reiteration of it as it relates to moving us away from fossil fuels and also meeting some of the challenges that will be put forth if we remain part of the Paris Accords.
Catherine, thanks so much. Roy, can I take you back? There's been a couple of questions, take you back on a structural issue. You mentioned Congress in your opening remarks and the important role of Congress. Once again, that's a little bit, the politics, the Westminster system's quite different from the US system. Could you just talk us through that issue of potentially a new presidency and a Congress, and how important that's going to be around climate change action?
Well, it's extremely important because even if we elect Biden and Harris and we retain the House of Representatives, if the Democrats don't take back the US Senate, then there's a huge roadblock there. It creates a problem for President Biden's appointments. Having a Republican Senate, it will bog down a lot of things there. So that's crucial. And so there are really two ways to look at this. If the Republicans retain the Senate, we're going to be in for a hard time going forward. And it will be really hard work in passing any kind of legislation that's meaningful on climate. Now, if the Democrats do control the Senate, and if President Biden and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer at that time can hold the Democrats in place, can hold 50 of them in place, then they can enact some of these things. Now, some of our listeners in this webinar may have heard discussions about the U.S. filibuster. Now, not to get into this too much because it's kind of an arcane process, but essentially what it means is that in the Senate, if a filibuster is in place, it takes 60 senators to break a filibuster and go to a vote on a piece of legislation. That's what's known as a supermajority. And it's virtually impossible to get that when your margin in the Senate is so thin. And after this election, it is likely to be, Democrats are likely to hold no more than, say, 53, 52, 51, maybe only 50 seats in the US Senate in order to have control. And that would mean you would have to be able to bring 7 or 8 or 9 Republicans over to support any kind of program. Now, there's a catch in this. The current Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, a Republican, has blown up the filibuster to ram through Supreme Court appointments. So it's entirely possible that the new Senate under Schumer and the newly elected Democrats will dispose of the filibuster to enact these critical programs that Biden and Harris and the Democratic Party would like to see. So to sum that all up, it is a challenge and it will require a great deal of political persuasion. And it will also involve a great deal of public persuasion. I was listening to Catherine talking about her experiences in South Alabama. And, you know, politicians can very easily turn off when they're having to listen to or read reports from scientists and experts. But when their constituents and people who have really been harmed, who have a face and a family and a place of where they live, they can't turn away from that. So public persuasion is going to have a lot to do with enacting a climate or environmental initiative in this next administration.
Roy, if I'm remembering correctly, in the first 2 years of the first Obama presidency, the Democrats had the Senate, and there was a major effort to get climate legislation, in essence a cap and trade, up through the Congress, and that floundered. Are there insights or observations you'd have reflecting on that in those times versus times now?
Yeah, it's an instructive example, Don, and you know we both watched that through your work with the Australian Climate Project and our work in Nashville with Al Gore at the time. It passed the House of Representatives by just a few votes, or maybe only 1 or 2 votes, a cap and trade proposal that would have begun this process. It never came up for a vote in the Senate, unfortunately, because a handful of Democratic senators did not want to vote on it. And they told the majority leader at the time, Harry Reid, that they would have to vote against it because they were from carbon intensive states, oil producing states like Louisiana and a few other places. And so they never voted on it. So frankly, the Democrats who had the majority at the time were not able to put it over because of the pressure exerted by the fossil fuel companies on members of Congress, especially Democrats who were up for re-election. Now, interestingly enough, none of those Democrats won their re-election anyway. So there wasn't a lot of courage there. One of the things that is really at short supply, and we've seen it with Republicans now for the last 4 years, a lack of any courage in pushing back on this president, even in his most vile and offensive actions and words. We occasionally see Democrats retreat from courage as well. So it's going to be a challenge, but it's going to take a lot of public persuasion. It's going to take a lot of media interest in this issue. And it's going to mean that President Biden will have to spend a good bit of political capital on this issue.
Thank you so much. Can I shift gears a tiny little bit and perhaps ask a question that's related globally? So just say after the inauguration, the US brings itself back into the climate agreement, the Paris Climate Accord, promptly. In the run-up to the actual Paris Agreement, the working together of President Obama and President Xi in China to basically present a leadership initiative from the US and China to the world, arguably was very important in getting the Paris Agreement across the line in 2015. The discourse may have changed and be challenging around US and China at the moment, but I'd love both of your reflections. So if the US comes back in, China's just recently announced they'll go for net zero by 2060, which is in line with the Paris Agreement long-term goals. What opportunities are there for leadership from the US and China again on climate change globally? Or what opportunities are there internationally for the US to build coalitions that will advance the Paris Agreement globally? Catherine, do you want to have a crack first on that?
Yeah, I'll take a crack at it. I think that
Sorry
there
about
are
the easy question.
I think that there are opportunities globally because, and I can't speak about China as much. I'm sure Roy would probably have a little bit more experience with that than I would. But in terms of other countries, I'm in touch with, people in India that are reaching out because of wastewater problems. People are having problems with water issues because of climate change, like in South Africa. Um, People in Kenya that are writing me where the US, this administration is talking about sending more plastic there and they're trying to do something about that. So I think that there are opportunities for lots of coalitions to be built, um, coalitions that have been destroyed or coalitions that just did not exist because of the insulting things that were said about people especially from people from African nations. So I think that there's an opportunity there for us to rebuild those coalitions, and for those of us like me who were not involved before that can also provide a bridge, because one of the things that I'm doing in terms of reaching out to people in on the African continent is that I don't think it's being used often enough. A lot of us that are African Americans, through the DNA testing, is finding out that we have relatives in a lot of these countries that are going to be very, very vital going forward in the future in terms of climate change, so that they won't end up turning to using fossil fuel to bring power and lights and so forth. We got to be able to work with them as well. And I believe that Black Americans could be very much a part of that process and helping to build those coalitions, especially those of us in the environmental justice movement.
Catherine, thanks so much. Roy?
Well, I think there's no doubt that we'll have a different tone in the relationship with China in a Biden-Harris administration. I mean, President Trump has done nothing but try to use China as kind of a whipping boy, so to speak, even so far as referring to this as the China virus and so on. I mean, he must feel like that by demonizing China and blowing up the relationship with China, that somehow helps him politically. But a stable relationship with the Chinese will allow the Biden administration to go back to the Congress and say, we can make this work. It is not going to be just a US sacrifice or so on. This is a world commitment. But it's also will take a sustainable commitment that is not simply being blown up every 4 years simply because we elect a different president. Somehow they're going to have to, not only the Biden administration, but everyone who believes in this issue will have to find a way to make this a sustainable commitment over time and not just from one election to the next. Because as we know, the time frame for solving this problem is not 1, 2, 4, 8 years. It's 50 years or so on. But having an international commitment and a discipline to meet those goals is going to be absolutely critical.
I've got a question here that's a little bit relevant to this. If Biden's elected, will the US's 2030 national NDC, National Development Commitment, so the existing commitment that the US has with the Paris Agreement or on the Paris Agreement, and that's a 26 to a 28% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, is there an opportunity for that to be ratcheted up? So there's a question. Do you think the US would be able to bring stronger positioning into the Paris Agreement itself, Roy?
Well, the answer is it depends. A personal commitment, a verbal commitment from a President Biden to the accord, coupled with an increased commitment. An increased commitment would mean probably he would have to probably get some support in the U.S. Congress for doing that. If he simply did that unilaterally, it would put him in a difficult situation politically in the beginning of his administration. But certainly, if he can build support in the Congress for meeting these commitments, yes, they can do that for sure. And as we know, even though Trump has abandoned these goals over the last 4 years, we've seen cities and states and corporations start doing what they could to reduce emissions. So the U.S. could do this through other means, could do part of it through other means, but it will take more than piecemeal efforts to meet such an expanded commitment for sure.
Catherine, would you have views on that? What's the chance or the opportunity to lift the ambition coming out of the US?
Well, I think that one thing that we've heard is that there will be an Office of Climate Change in the White House. And I think that in itself will send signals to various communities around the world that we're serious. In addition to that, I'm seeing that a lot of people, that a lot of investors, social impact investors are reaching out, are very, very interested in what could potentially happen as it relates to climate change. And even some, we've seen evidence of some power companies that are switching, moving away from fossil fuels and moving toward renewable energy. And even some of the big, fossil fuel producers are switching and putting some of their investments into renewable energy. But I think people think that it's coming. The question is when and how much.
How much, once again, sitting in Australia, there's a dynamic here. The business community or parts of the business community have been shifting their views on climate change. And significant elements of the business community in Australia, including major businesses, are now strongly in favour of strong action. For example, the Business Council of Australia, which is an umbrella body for mainstream businesses, has recently committed to net zero by 2050. I'm assuming in the US, the business community is a substantial influence on the politics. Could you just talk a little bit about where you see that influence from the business community at the moment? Because Catherine, you've spoken about the community sector. So I'm interested in that business community as another strong influence on politics. And are there now a wide diversity of voices and views in the business community on climate change coming in on any political party? Catherine, would you have a view on that?
Well, I've seen even the people that have been asking me to come and speak, I don't know what kind of commitments they've made, but I've noticed that people have asked. I've been addressing a lot of different groups that I never thought would be interested or wanted to hear my voice. So I think that there's a commitment, but I was in Paris when COP21 was negotiated, and the hotel where I stayed was a hotel where there was like a chamber of this International Chamber of Commerce that was meeting there with businesses from around the world that were there. And they were making their own commitments. And I think that as part of social responsibility and with young people pushing and marching and talking about the need to address climate change, that it will not be in a company's best interest or a corporation best interest to be seen as being a contributor, So I think that it's kind of like the Black Lives Matter movement. We can't talk about climate change and climate justice without talking about Black Lives Matter versus vice versa. And I think that there's an opportunity to push not only for those of us that will be in the streets and protesting, but also to get the business communities to push to make sure that they can put in place objectives that can be reached, or people will start voting with their money and putting it somewhere else.
Thanks, Catherine. Roy?
Well, there has been leadership in the business community on this issue because corporations generally don't want to be on the wrong side of public opinion. Now, that doesn't necessarily follow for the large fossil fuel industries. I mean, like Coke Industries and some of the large players like that, oil companies and so on. But yes, I think they will have an impact. If nothing else, if they will not work hard against climate legislation, it would make a difference. there's a lot of duplicity in some of the fossil fuel companies in this area. There's a lot of greenwashing, so you never really know. But you're never going to get 80, 90, 100% of all these large players behind something. It'll take guts to bring them along. I mean, you can't make everybody happy with something as critically important as this. But big companies, and certainly the technology companies, which now drive the U.S. economy, will play I think will play a significant role in this.
Thank you so much. Roy and Catherine, we're running out of time. So, and I know it's getting later in the evening for you there. I just sincerely want to thank you both for a great conversation. You've been very generous with your time. It's really helpful for people out in this region because we've got a different political system, and your insights, and for both of you, your service on the community side and the government processes side is absolutely inspiring. So I want to sincerely thank you both. I should give a plug to both of your books. Roy, The Electors, who, as I said at the beginning, hopefully you're hard at work right now. And Catherine, your book on waste is coming out when? Is that November 17?
November 17th, yes.
That's great. But look, could I sincerely thank you? And I'm going to clap online, so you won't hear everybody, but it's been a great conversation. Thank you so much for your time. And just for our audience, keep an eye on the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute newsletter, and you'll get notice on our next seminar in this series. But thank you for everybody who's attended, and in particular, Roy and Catherine, thank you so much, and we bid you good evening.
Thanks, Don. Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you, Roy. Bye-bye.